She told her boyfriend not to worry. It was just a quick visit to her father's house. A cousin had come in from Pakistan, he said. Just dinner. Maybe a little awkward, but family. And no matter how bitter things had been, family still meant something to Hina. Or so she hoped. She didn't know her grave had already been dug. 2 meters behind the kitchen window, beneath a patch of freshly turned soil in the backyard, the earth had been quietly prepared for her. Her father had done it himself, with help. 2 other men, her own brothers-in-law, stood by and watched, knowing what was about to unfold. He had chosen the knife already, he had rehearsed the lies. And when he called her home, it wasn't out of love, it was a sentence. That night, August 11, 2006, Hina Salim stepped into her childhood home one last time. She wasn't running from anything. She wasn't hiding. She walked in as a daughter, still believing that some part of her family might accept who she had become. That love might be stronger than pride, that blood might be thicker than rage. She was wrong. They didn't argue, they didn't scream, they just attacked. 28 wounds to her throat, silent, swift, and surgical. No neighbors heard a sound, no chance to run, no time to fight back. She was dead before her shift at the pizzeria even began. Wrapped, dragged. Buried like a secret under a rose bush by the very man who gave her life. And when she didn't return home that night, her boyfriend Giuseppe panicked. He called, and called again. No answer. He filed a report. He pleaded with the police, because Hina was never late. This is not just a crime story. This is the story of Hina Salim, and today we choose to remember her. Welcome to the crime series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Hina Salim was born on December 19, 1985, in the city of Gujarat, located in Pakistan's Punjab province. She was the youngest daughter in a family deeply rooted in traditional Islamic values, a community where customs ran deep and family reputation meant everything. In this close-knit environment, children were raised to understand their roles early. For girls, that meant learning modesty, obedience, and submission. Life choices weren't just personal, they were often made for you. Her father, Muhammad Salim, was a man of strict principles and strong religious beliefs. He saw himself as the guardian of his family's honor, and like many men from rural Punjab, he felt a deep sense of duty to preserve their way of life, even if it meant doing so in a land far from home. In 1996, he made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. Driven by economic need and the dream of a better future, Muhammad Salim left Pakistan for Italy, where he settled in Cerezzo, a small town in the province of Brescia, nestled in northern Italy. He found work in a local saucepan factory, living modestly, saving money, and preparing for the day he could reunite with his wife and children. 3 years later, in 1999, his family joined him in Italy. Hina was still in her early teens, young enough to absorb new surroundings, yet old enough to feel the shift in identity that came with migration. Italy was a different world. The language, the freedom, the social norms, everything clashed with the values she had been taught. But for Hina, it was not frightening, it was freeing. She learned Italian quickly, excelling in school and adjusting faster than her older siblings. Teachers noticed how bright and curious she was. Friends described her as warm, talkative, and eager to fit in, not by changing who she was, but by growing into something more. Italy, to Hina, wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to become. Still at home, nothing changed. Inside their small apartment in Cerezzo, the rules remained the same as they had been in Gujarat. Girls were expected to stay silent, dress conservatively, and obey the men in the family. Western clothing was frowned upon. Friendships with boys were forbidden. Dating was unimaginable. And marriage, always arranged, was seen as a family duty, not a personal choice. That split between inside and outside, between the freedom of the streets and the restrictions of the home, created a quiet storm in Hina's life. She began to see things differently than her parents and siblings. On the streets of Brescia, she saw Italian girls walk to school alone, speak freely, laugh out loud, She watched them wear jeans, go to cafes, work part-time jobs. They spoke about dreams, not duties. They planned their futures without asking for permission. At first, Hina tried to balance both worlds. She was respectful at home, but slowly began to explore life outside. She made Italian friends. She listened to music on her headphones. She wore Western-style clothes when she could. These may have seemed like small acts, but in her family, they were acts of rebellion. Mohammed Salim didn't miss the signs. He watched his daughter becoming someone he didn't recognize, someone who questioned rather than obeyed. And for a man raised to believe that a daughter's behavior reflects on the family's name, that was dangerous. But Hina wasn't being reckless. She was being herself. She wasn't trying to shame her family. She was trying to live. As the years passed, the gap between cultures inside and outside their apartment only grew wider. Hina was no longer the little girl from Gujarat. She was becoming an Italian young woman, with her own ideas, her own goals, and a quiet but steady courage to follow them. Friends later describe her as bubbly, confident, and outspoken. She liked listening to Italian music and had an infectious laugh. Despite being under pressure at home, she never hid her identity in public. By her late teens, Hina Salim had started working as a waitress at a local restaurant in Brescia called Antica India. It was a popular spot that served both Italian and South Asian dishes, and it quickly became more than just a workplace for Hina. The job gave her something she had been quietly craving for years: freedom. She earned her own money. She spoke Italian freely. She made friends. She smiled and laughed with customers. It was a taste of independence, and she loved every moment of it. But at home, she kept the job a secret. Her father didn't approve of her working in public, especially at a restaurant where she served food and spoke with men. In his view, a young Pakistani woman should stay out of sight, dress modestly, and wait for an arranged marriage. But Hina had other dreams. She knew the risks of defying those expectations, but she wasn't ready to give up her new life. Her manager at the restaurant, Grumail Multani, later said she was a bright, hard-working young woman, always smiling, always polite. She was proud of the work she did, even if it had to stay hidden from her family. It was during one of her shifts at Antica India that she met Giuseppe Beppe Tempini, a 33-year-old carpenter who often came in for lunch. He was quiet, respectful, and kind, nothing flashy or forceful. But he noticed Hina, and Hina noticed him too. At first, it was simple: friendly conversation over orders, a shared smile, small talk. But as weeks passed, that connection grew. Giuseppe admired Hina's courage, her energy, and her sense of humor. And Hina felt safe with him, seen, listened to, never judged. Their friendship slowly turned into something more. They began spending time together outside of the restaurant: walks, phone calls, simple moments that felt meaningful. For Hina, this wasn't just a romantic relationship. It was a statement, a quiet act of rebellion. She was choosing her own path for the first time in her life. No arranged meetings, no pressure, no rules, just two people who cared for each other. Giuseppe supported her in every way. He never tried to change her. He respected her background, but he didn't use it against her. He never told her how to dress, who to speak to, or how to act. He simply wanted her to be herself. Eventually, Hina made a decision that would forever change the course of her life. She moved in with Giuseppe. It was a major turning point. In the eyes of her family, especially her father, this was unforgivable. Living with a non-Muslim man outside of marriage was seen not just as inappropriate, but as a complete rejection of their values. But for Hina, it was a necessary choice. She needed space, safety, a life where she could breathe. Her new home was small but peaceful. She cooked meals, watched TV, and talked about the future with Giuseppe. She still missed her family, especially her mother and siblings, but she knew that going back meant surrendering everything she had fought for. She hoped that, in time, her father would come to understand, that he might accept her decisions, or at least stop trying to control them. Giuseppe's family welcomed her without hesitation. Hina wasn't just tolerated, she was embraced. She helped with household chores, shared meals, laughed with Giuseppe's parents, and joined family gatherings. In many ways, she had found the warmth and acceptance she never fully received at home. It gave her a sense of safety, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She kept working at Pizzeria Antica India, where she was known for her smile, her kindness, and her work ethic. The job gave her more than just income, it gave her dignity. She took pride in earning her own money and making her own decisions. Hina spoke often of her dreams. She wanted to move to a bigger city someday, maybe Milan. She imagined traveling across Europe, seeing new places, trying new things, and one day opening a business of her own. Her dreams were simple, they were human, and they were hers. But even as her new life grew stronger, the shadows of her old life never fully faded. Her father, Muhammad Salim, was still watching. Still waiting, still angry. His disappointment was no secret. He had wanted her to follow the path chosen for her. A quiet life, modest clothes, an arranged marriage, and silence. Instead, she had chosen jeans, public work, and an Italian man. Hina knew the risks. But she stayed. She fought quietly, she believed in her right to live freely, and she refused to let fear decide for her. She wasn't rebelling to hurt anyone, she was simply trying to live. That alone became a crime in her family's eyes. By her early 20s, Hina had become skilled at living two lives. In public, she was confident and warm, laughing with co-workers, serving customers, walking hand in hand with Giuseppe down the streets of Brescia. But in private, she lived with unease. She avoided certain streets. She kept her job a secret from her family. She watched for unfamiliar cars. She was free, but never entirely safe. Behind the independence she projected was a young woman who was constantly looking over her shoulder. She wasn't afraid of strangers. She was afraid of her own blood. Between 2003 and 2006, Hina made several formal complaints to Italian police. In those reports, she spoke of being emotionally and physically abused by her father. She described being followed, threatened, and harassed, both at home and in public. She said her relatives had become increasingly controlling, especially after she rejected the arranged marriage they had planned for her. She feared being forced back to Pakistan against her will. She feared losing everything she had built. Each time she went to the authorities, she spoke with honesty. But each time, she later withdrew the complaint. Investigators believe it was likely due to fear, of backlash, of shame, of being further isolated. Yet the reports remained, and later, in court, those police files became critical evidence. To Muhammad Salim, a devout Muslim from rural Punjab, family honor rested heavily on his daughter's obedience. Her refusal to submit, her Western clothing, her employment in a public restaurant, and above all, her decision to live with an Italian man outside marriage. All these became, in his eyes, intolerable violations. Even neighbors began to notice the tension. Some recalled that Hina rarely visited the family home after moving in with Giuseppe. She was no longer seen as part of their world. She had become, in a cultural sense, an outsider to her own blood. But Hina refused to hide. Around this time, the Italian press painted a vivid picture of how deeply Hina had embraced life in her adopted country. Some reports described her as the kind of young woman who might have even joined the World Cup celebrations that summer, cheering in the streets, waving flags, sharing in the national joy. While there's no official record confirming she did, these portrayals captured more than just a possibility. They reflected the widening cultural distance between Hina and the world her family expected her to remain in. If you've made it this far, take a moment to support the channel. These stories take time, research, and care to tell the right way, especially when the voices involved can no longer speak for themselves. Click subscribe and help us keep their stories alive, because every name deserves to be remembered. Hina Salim's father had also set plans in motion for her future. He intended for her to marry a cousin back in their homeland, an arranged marriage that aligned with the family's traditional values. For her father, this decision was not merely about family ties. It was about preserving their culture, restoring dignity, and reinforcing control over a daughter he believed had strayed too far from their expectations. But Hina never accepted the proposal. Though her father envisioned her returning to Pakistan as a dutiful daughter and bride, she remained in Italy. By continuing to live with her Italian boyfriend and working as a waitress, she quietly defied the future her father had mapped out. Her refusal wasn't declared with drama. It was shown through her actions, her silence, her continued independence. In his view, she had broken family traditions and brought shame to their name. Her decision not to go along with the arranged marriage marked a deeper divide. While her mother and siblings prepared to leave, Hina chose to stay behind, further cementing the growing chasm between her and her family. In the eyes of her father, her refusal was more than disobedience. It was a rejection of heritage, and it set the stage for a tragic reckoning. Her mother, Bushra Begum, and her siblings eventually traveled back to Pakistan in 2006. Hina was expected to join them, but she refused. She feared that if she returned to Pakistan, she might be coerced into marriage or prevented from coming back to Italy. Her refusal widened the gulf between her and her family, particularly with her father. The psychological strain was growing. Hina spoke to Giuseppe about wanting peace with her family, but knew reconciliation would only come on their terms. Her attempts to maintain some form of contact were met with coldness or pressure to change. Her father, known for his strict views and temper, was said to be watching her every move, waiting for the moment to confront her. What she didn't know was that her father had already made up his mind. In the weeks leading up to the fatal incidents, Muhammad Salim confided in two of his sons-in-law, his accomplices. Together, they discussed what he called a solution to the dishonor. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was premeditated. He believed that restoring his family's name required Hina's silence, permanently. Sometime in early August, Hina received a message from her father, Muhammad Salim. He told her that a cousin had arrived from Pakistan and asked her to come home to meet her. It was framed as a simple family visit, nothing more. Hina, despite the long-standing tensions with her father and the unease she had long expressed about returning to the house, accepted the invitation. She had always hoped for some form of reconciliation. That hope would prove fatal. On the evening of August 11, 2006, she spoke with Giuseppe and told him not to worry. She also contacted her manager at Pizzeria Antica India to let him know she would be late for her shift, but planned to come in. No one knew then that those would be the final messages she would send. Hina arrived at the family home in Zanano di Sarezzo with no idea that her death had already been planned. Her father had dug a grave in the backyard the day before. With the help of two sons-in-law, her brothers-in-law, he had plotted out the murder. The killing was not spontaneous or emotional. It was deliberate. Inside the house that night, Hina was attacked. Her throat was wounded 28 times. The brutality of the act stunned forensic investigators. There were no reports of neighbors hearing screams. The bloodshed was quick, silent, and final. After she was dead, her body was wrapped and dragged into the backyard, where she was buried in the shallow grave her father had prepared. Meanwhile, at home, Giuseppe waited. He called her repeatedly. No answer. The night passed, then the next morning. She still hadn't returned. Panic took hold. He reached out to her friends, her manager, and finally to the police. He filed a missing person report and insisted something was wrong. Hina was never late without warning. She was responsible. She wouldn't disappear without explanation. Italian police responded swiftly. They were already familiar with the family. Hina had made several reports of mistreatment between 2003 and 2006, all later withdrawn. But the history was there, and the circumstances of her disappearance raised immediate red flags. On August 13, just 2 days after she was last seen, police conducted a full search of the Salim family home. In the garden, they noticed freshly disturbed soil. When they began to dig, they found what they feared most: Hina's body. She had suffered a fatal neck wound, and her grave had been hastily covered just meters from the house. The discovery confirmed what investigators already suspected. This had not been a case of disappearance or a runaway. It was a manslaughter, planned, executed, and concealed by her own family. Her father, Muhammad Salim, was located and arrested. He had briefly checked himself into a hospital and, according to reports, offered no resistance when confronted. Two of his sons-in-law were also arrested in connection with the crime. All three were charged with manslaughter and concealment of a corpse. What shocked the nation even more than the fatal incident was the motive. Mohammed Salim confessed that he had taken his daughter's life to restore the family's honor. She had refused to marry the cousin he had chosen for her in Pakistan. She had moved out, worked in public, dressed like an Italian, and lived with a non-Muslim man without marriage. These were the reasons he gave. These were the justifications he believed were valid. Authorities later confirmed that the manslaughter was premeditated. The grave had been prepared in advance. The knife had been selected. The visit was a trap. Hina had been lured back to her childhood home, not to reconnect with family, but to be silenced by it. The arrest of Mohammed Salim and his accomplices sent shockwaves through Italy. It triggered national debate on honor-based violence, integration, and the rights of women in immigrant communities. Interior Minister Giuliano Amato halted plans to streamline citizenship applications, stating that applicants must be committed to respecting Italian values. Chief among them, the individual freedoms of women. Giuseppe, shattered by the loss, would later serve as a plaintiff in the case. His statements painted the portrait of a woman who only wanted to live freely and love openly, but was ultimately betrayed by those meant to protect her. Hina Salim's life ended not in a faraway village or during a civil dispute abroad, but in the garden of her own family home in northern Italy. Her death was not the result of a stranger's cruelty, but a father's obsession with control and a twisted sense of honor. With the arrests complete and the facts undeniable, the question left in the hearts of many was simple, haunting, and impossible to ignore. How could a daughter's life been taken and buried in her own backyard simply for wanting to choose her own life? The arrest of Mohammed Salim and his two sons-in-law marked the beginning of a long legal and emotional process. Italy, a country that had once grappled with its own legacy of honor-based violence, now faced a brutal reminder that such crimes could still happen, even decades after they were officially outlawed. In the months following the manslaughter, the prosecution moved quickly. Investigators had built a solid case. There was no ambiguity. Mohammed Salim had confessed. Forensic evidence, including the condition of Hina's body, confirmed the premeditated nature of the crime. The grave had been dug in advance. The knife had been selected. The call to bring her home was part of a calculated trap. The trial began in 2007 in Brescia, where the courtroom was filled with grief, outrage, and disbelief. The three accused men, Hina's father and her two brothers-in-law, were charged with aggravated voluntary homicide and concealment of a corpse. Mohammed Salim stood at the center of the proceedings, unrepentant and firm in his belief that his actions were justified. In court, he admitted he had killed his daughter because she had dishonored the family. She had rejected an arranged marriage with a cousin in Pakistan. She had left the family home. She wore jeans, she smoked, she worked in public. She lived with a man. To him, those choices were a betrayal, not just of family, but of tradition, of identity, of control. When asked if he regretted his actions, he reportedly said no. The prosecutors presented a thorough, unflinching picture of Hina's final hours. They walked the court through the timeline, how she had been lured home, how she was attacked with a knife, and how she was buried in the backyard just moments after her death. Testimony from forensic experts confirmed that Hina had suffered multiple deep wounds to her throat, precise, fatal, and indicative of rage. Her boyfriend, Giuseppe Tempini, sat in the courtroom, devastated. He had filed the initial missing person report. He had alerted police when she didn't return. Now he listened to the graphic details of how the woman he loved had been betrayed and silenced. Giuseppe testified as a civil plaintiff in the case, his voice breaking as he described their life together, their hopes, her dreams, and the simple happiness they shared in their small apartment. He spoke of how Hina had never stopped wanting some form of peace with her family, how she had held out hope, even at the very end. The defense tried to argue cultural context. They said Mohammed Salim acted not out of cruelty, but confusion, that he had been overwhelmed by the contrast between traditional values and a modern world he couldn't understand. But the court rejected that argument entirely. Italian law had long abolished any leniency for so-called honor killings. In fact, Italy had repealed Article 587, the provision allowing reduced sentences for such crimes, in 1981. This was not a case of cultural misunderstanding. This was manslaughter. The court emphasized that cultural values could not and would not override fundamental human rights. A woman's right to live freely, to love whom she chooses, to work, to dress as she pleases. These were not negotiable. Hina Salim had chosen freedom, and for that, she was killed. In June 2007, all three men were found guilty. Muhammad Salim and his two sons-in-law were each sentenced to 30 years in prison. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read, but outside, the reaction was explosive. Women's rights groups, human rights advocates, and immigrant organizations all responded. For some, it was a moment of justice. For others, it was a painful reminder of the silent struggles many immigrant women faced, caught between cultures, expectations, and fear. Italian media covered the verdict extensively. Editorials described Hina's murder as a wake-up call and a tragedy born of patriarchal pride. Journalists reflected on how easily this might have gone unnoticed, if not for Giuseppe's vigilance, if not for the police acting quickly. They asked how many other women might be silently suffering in the shadows. The fatal incident also sparked debates around integration policies. The Interior Minister at the time, Giuliano Amato, publicly condemned the fatal incident. He emphasized that integration into Italian society required a commitment to constitutional values, including the equality and freedom of women. Amato suspended proposals that would have shortened the waiting time for immigrants applying for Italian citizenship, stating that respect for human rights must be non-negotiable. Across Europe, the case was cited in conversations about multiculturalism and the limits of tolerance. Could a society protect religious and cultural freedoms while still drawing clear lines on gender equality? For many, the answer came through Hina's story. She had done everything society asks of young women. She worked hard, she followed the law, she spoke up when she felt unsafe. She chose love, honestly and openly. Yet none of it was enough to protect her from a system of control that saw her body and choices as property. Though her killers were behind bars, Hina's name remained on banners, in headlines, in parliamentary debates. Her case was studied by law students, referenced in policy papers, and used as an example in campaigns against domestic and honor-based violence. In the town of Brescia, where she had once served tables with a warm smile, people gathered to remember her, not just as a victim, but as a young woman who wanted to live her life fully. Her employer, co-workers, and neighbors described her as cheerful, intelligent, and kind. A woman full of life, not fear. Justice had been served in the courtroom. But the work of changing hearts, laws, and cultural blind spots was only just beginning. Around the same time, a Center for Intercultural and International Health in Brescia was officially dedicated in Hina's memory. The facility had been inaugurated in 2007, but was now named in her honor, a lasting tribute to the values she represented. Its mission was to foster dialogue, understanding, and respect between cultures, exactly the kind of engagement that might prevent tragedies like hers in the future. Public reaction remained strong. Women's rights advocates continued to speak Hina's name, using her story to challenge deep-seated beliefs and dangerous silences. Memorial gatherings were held at her grave. At one such event, mourners placed red roses, shared reflections on the young woman who had become a symbol of resistance. One prominent voice urged society to remember that Hina's murder was not just a crime. It was a message about what happens when fear, control, and patriarchal pride are allowed to rule unchecked. As the legal chapter closed, a quieter but equally painful reckoning began. Hina was buried in the Muslim section of the monumental cemetery of Brescia. Her final resting place, however, spoke volumes. For years the grave remained neglected, unmarked, overgrown, and unnoticed. There was no headstone to honor her, no flowers to signal remembrance. The absence of a proper memorial reflected the same erasure she had battled in life. A refusal by some to acknowledge her as a woman with a voice, with choices, and with dignity. Though Hina's voice was silenced, her story echoed across borders. In Italy, Her case became one of the earliest and most prominent examples used to highlight the dangers of imported patriarchal violence disguised as cultural practice. The legal system had to deliver a sentence, but the larger battle against the belief systems that justified her killing was far from over. Today, her memory persists not only in court records and newspaper headlines, but in the continued advocacy for women like her. She is remembered as a young woman who wanted to live on her own terms, who chose jeans over a veil, love over obligation, freedom over submission. In the end, it was those very choices that led her family to betray her. Yet in many ways, Hina won. Her life, however short, laid bare the quiet struggles many women endure behind closed doors. Her murder sparked not only justice in court, but also a national awakening. And though her grave had once stood silent, it now carries a name, one that will not be forgotten. If Hina's story moved you, don't let it end here. Her voice was taken, but we can still make sure she's heard. Subscribe to this channel to help us share more stories like hers, stories of courage, silence, survival, and truth. Because remembering them is how we protect the next.